I'm Srihari. I work at Lenso. I've been writing Clojure for a while, and I'm interested in growing it. Today's talk is about growing Clojure in the company, and it's specifically about two things. One is about fostering growth for beginners and intermediates, and another thing is about enabling success for Clojure in your company at large. A slightly higher view. A little about me. I have been writing Clojure for about 10 years at Lenso. I have trained folks here. I have run courses for clients, multiple batches over the years. I've taught at workshops. I organized in Clojure. I've taught at Clojure bridges. I like Clojure, and I want to see more of it around, and I'm hoping this talk helps a little bit. I want to talk about four things. So, first, I want to talk about what the challenges are in growing Clojure within the company, and how it differs with respect to other languages. The bulk of my talk will be about training beginners, and then there's a small section about supporting intermediates, and the last section will be about the organizational level of ensuring success. In terms of the challenges, there are these four challenges, and I just start digging into them one by one. First, there are multiple paradigm shifts, and it's important to acknowledge them. We often see beginners struggling with a wide variety of issues, or rather it seems like a wide variety of issues, while in reality it's actually just these four things in Clojure's single line description of it being a dynamic functional Lisp hosted on the JVM. For someone, for example, coming from Java, a shift in thinking functionally is going to be a massive one. For someone who's coming from Ruby, Lisp will be a massive shift, right? Like the editor is different, the way you edit code, it's not lines and characters anymore, it's the AST itself, or it's blocks of code. And making that shift is hard. Changing all your keyboard shortcuts is very hard. Learning an entirely different development workflow of the REPL. All of these things are doable, but they are not as easy as they might seem. Clojure is not just another language to learn. That's sort of what I'm getting at. And even for someone experienced in a bunch of these things, the JVM might be new, right? So it helps really to address these larger themes rather than the individual pain points. And as a company, you can choose to do this as in your bootcamp and in how you groom individuals. When someone wants to learn a new language, say Rust or Ruby or something, they can just Google things. They have a whole bunch of answers in Stack Overflow. And around this time when people are sort of trying to find a job, they have tried out a couple of languages and they have a way of going about it. That doesn't necessarily work for Clojure. Or even if it does, it's not the best way to go about it. Idioms are not widely understood. You're not likely going to get great answers of blog posts on idioms. And you definitely, it's very unlikely that you have friends who can just look over your shoulder and tell you, oh yeah, you're writing Clojure and this thing is wrong. Yeah, I'll just pull someone in from the office who knows Clojure. That's not as likely as it might be in other languages. The good news, though, is that this problem has a local maxima in your company. You can actually try to solve it if you have a reasonable user base in your company. Another elephant in the room is hiring senior devs. We need them to train beginners, to drive outcomes, and they're very expensive, absolutely necessary, but hard to come by. And the only alternative we are sort of left with is growing them in-house, which is hard. It takes a lot of time, but it's doable. Another sort of self-inflicted pain is these sort of prejudices. I've seen a lot of folks who don't use the REPL, even though they've been writing Clojure for years, or they don't use the REPL well enough. And some folks believe they don't need to write unit tests because they know that their code works. So why do you need tests? Or they REPL into production to hotfix things and it breaks other things and it's very expensive. not just for the company or the business, but it's also expensive for the credibility of Clojure in the company. So there's a whole bunch of these things, and I feel like the root problem still lies in how people learn the language. And so whatever training happens has to be holistic. It's not just about learning Clojure. It's about it's about learning how to be a good developer, right? So writing your tests, working well with product, if that's what your developers do, getting things done end to end. All of that is very, very important. Team ownership is very important. So all of these things need to be taught, or all of these things need to be instilled right from the beginning. And so that's what I'm going to talk about, right? I'm going to talk about how I think training beginners can be very effective. And it's a very simple thing, right? Like you have a boot camp, you have a course. I have some thoughts around structuring the course, and we'll talk a little bit about supporting people through the course. So the boot camp itself, I think, should be somewhere between 1 and 3 months. Less than a month, it's not enough time, and more than 3 months, you start to feel unproductive. And that's sort of the sweet spot. So 1 to 3 months depends on what you plan to do, what you plan to achieve, what the content of the course is then. And also depends on the caliber of the student, but that's roughly the ballpark. 1 to 4, I think, is a decent teacher to student ratio. I once tried, simul chess playing with a whole bunch of Clojure folks trying to refactor their code, but as you can imagine, that didn't pan out very well. So I wouldn't go too heavy on that. Go light on active teaching. Stay away from monologuing or giving discourses. It's not that useful at the end of the day. Sometimes it's important to zoom out and talk about a topic as a whole, and provide understanding of a broad range of things covered in one sort of segment. But for the most part, it's very effective to let people learn by themselves while doing it, while writing Clojure. That's where people learn most, and you can pair with them during that time to help them. I cannot overestimate the effectiveness of having a peer group. People are excited and motivated to do really well when they have their peers around. This is nothing specific to Clojure at all. This is just true universally. And I would strongly urge you to consider doing that. Even if you have someone learning by themselves as an individual, try to have some sort of peer group, maybe someone who's new to Clojure relatively, to work with them, look at their work, show them the solutions for the same exercises they did earlier, things like that. Batching is definitely a lot more efficient, so do that where you can. But if you can't, all the above principles still hold good for individuals who are going through your onboarding journey. One fun thing I've learned is that you can try to fund the bootcamp with your hiring budget, in the sense that if you aren't able to hire Clojure devs, you can use that money to train Clojure devs in your company, either people who are already in there or people that you're hiring fresh but who don't know Clojure yet. It's at least a part of the budget can be portioned for this, and so you can make the case for a reasonably sized bootcamp in your company. So moving on to the principles, like this is one of the biggest takeaways for me, which is, I've long had the temptation to build something useful at the end of it. Oh, I can maybe extract this library out, or I can build a small service that will be really useful for this part of thing, or I can automate something in the back office. That doesn't work, primarily because these things have different goals. Building something useful needs you to make less mistakes. It has the objective of reaching out to the people who will actually end up using it and ensuring that it will be actually useful. And that's very different from going wide, making mistakes, exploring, and learning. So have exercises, but don't necessarily expect them to be useful at the end of the day. You can always build something useful when you're done learning or done with the bootcamp. Create incremental goals and tight feedback loops around them. This is a bit abstract, so I'll have an actual example course ahead, which will elucidate this a little better. Train holistically, right? So this is what I was saying earlier. Don't just teach the language. Teach them to be a good developer. So get the setup out of the way and focus on learning to use Clojure. It doesn't need to be about setting up the editor or figuring out which JSON parser or which HTTP client to use. That's not the point of any of this. The point is to learn to use the language first and foremost. Figuring out libraries or the setup can happen later. These things happen less frequently than using the language. So it's important to get that first. If you focus on the setup, you're impeding the learning by a lot because the focus goes into the setup. Another big learning for me has been to bridge the gap between the bootcamp and what you do at work. And you can do this by creating an exercise that is in the company's domain with all the sort of same context that you would use on the job. So use the exact same libraries. If you're building a data pipelines using Clojure at your job, build a small data pipeline as the exercise. So provide all the same setup, the same library choices. So people are then familiar with those library choices, familiar with the general setup they will be using while they're learning, right? So it's oftentimes you come out of the bootcamp thinking this is a toy language. When you're faced with real projects or like real problems, you're a bit lost. Yeah, I learned all the map reduce and everything, but I don't know how to apply that here. So this would be instrumental in bridging that gap. The last thing I would say is get ample face time with the creator of the language, by which what I mean is watch his videos. By which what I mean is get familiar with the philosophy of the language, the rationales, principles behind how it was, why it was built the way it was built. This really lets you use it in a way that you deeply understand it. This goes a long way in cementing those fundamentals that you want to be strong when you build on top of it. You can't build on weak fundamentals. So here's the example course I was saying. This is a very simple structure that I tend to use. So just about 6 weeks. The first week you just do Clojure from the ground up. The next 2 entire weeks you just do four Clojure problems where you pair with them. For another week after that you do a small interview problem like Mars rover. And then you spend a couple of weeks or more on the contextual domain problem that I mentioned a little earlier. And here's then the incremental holistic feedback loops that I was talking about. So in the first week, while they're learning the language, ensure that they are using the REPL inside the editor, ensure their editor is set up correctly. And then there's the four Clojure problems, right? There's with the four Clojure problems, like move towards structural editing, ensure that they are getting their shortcuts right and they are not, backspacing on parentheses. This is the very good time to handhold their REPL workflow. It's very useful to invest your time here. Cement the fundamentals again, because there's a lot of leverage that this will give you later on, and this is also a great place for the idioms to start surfacing. And then with an exercise like Mars rover, you start bringing in some modeling, design decisions that they need to make, and then you start writing tests and make PRs that are reviewed, and you have to address those review comments and then get them merged. So that gives you a little larger sort of a cycle on developing something. And then with the domain problem, you have the actual domain itself, the libraries that you use with that, and collaborating with other people, which brings a real sense of seriousness and this sort of a steep learning curve that you expect from your bootcamp. So in terms of providing support, here are some examples. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this because you sort of get the idea now. Just be there for them, handhold them through their bootcamp so that they get the fundamentals right. So for this setup, automate everything. For the REPL workflow, handhold it. For using Clojure code effectively, use for Clojure and refer to other people's solutions. Let them watch you refactor to learn idioms. If you want to discourage their imperative thinking, discourage the use of, plain old reduce or loop recur, so that they are forced to use other declarative choices. I'll skip this for time. And I haven't listed any reading materials, but I have written out an article that has categories of learning and reading materials inside each of them. So I'll leave this link here with all of that for you. For supporting intermediates, I'm thinking, like, when people come out of their boot camp and it's been about 6 months or a year or so, how do you offer continual support? Where do you get the time, and where do they normally get stuck? That sort of stuff. So in terms of finding the time, pairing is very expensive, but it's also extremely effective. So if you find the time for it, do it. But if you aren't able to pair when you are reviewing their code, or when you do want to refactor their code, get on a call with them and do it with them, or do it with a few people potentially. That way you maximize the effect, the impact that you have in the time that you are given. And even better, try to record these videos so then other people can watch them at their time. Reviewing PRs is something you do anyway as a part of your workflow, I'm assuming, but give context when you respond in your PRs. Point them towards articles that will let them read about the broader topic. And definitely structure, have some feedback at regular intervals to give them an overall idea of where they are in their Clojure skills and how far they have to go in order to learn more. A lot of people who come to Clojure, who come to your company from the experience of learning Clojure elsewhere, won't usually have the same sort of strong fundamentals that the beginners in your company might have, because you have handheld them. They might have understood concepts much more deeply than your lateral hires. So point them towards it, right? Point them towards the beginner material, reinforce those fundamentals. And I have seen that intermediates usually need help in these kinds of areas. So debugging, they're not familiar with what the editor has to offer, debuggers, or using the REPL to debug. They don't know exactly what data structures to use beyond just maps. Or they don't know how to extract namespaces. They're looking for something like an MVC where they can, they know what code goes where. They don't have that here necessarily. Or they come from an OO pattern and looking for OO background and they're looking for design patterns. Stuff like that. I'm not going to give you solutions right here, but this link that I mentioned earlier has specific categories for these things where there is a list of detailed material that you can point them towards. And in terms of enabling success for the organization as a whole, I want to talk about what new problems emerge as your team grows. Like beyond 5 people, beyond 10 people, you hit a new sort of new set of problems. And what are some things that you can do to ensure Clojure's success? Choosing a language that advocates simplicity is not enough, right? You'd have to go a long way actually in ensuring that the code you write with it also remains simple. So this is a variation of Spiderman that I thought was more appropriate here. As your team grows, the number of people that are using Clojure also grows, and so the responsibility that you all have together is much larger. And it's a bit idealistic to think that you will only hire responsible individuals. And when you grow larger and larger, you're not going to have a great amount of control over that. So the only other option that you end up having is to restrict access to that power, right? The power being you can do whatever you want with Clojure in whatever form you want. You can build on top of the language. Well, don't. Try to keep it simple. Try to keep it purposeful towards what the intent is, what your company needs, right? So digging in a little bit into that, I would recommend picking convention over configuration, especially for a larger team. I understand this is controversial, but I will stick to it. I'm not asking you to write a framework, but choose the libraries you use as a company. If you see large companies that use Clojure, this is a big part of their success formula, right? Like they either use a framework or they have all these conventions sort of set. So don't deviate from them unless there's a very good reason. If you create a template project, that will go a long way in you know, having these libraries set right from the beginning, and provides a decent shooting pad. And then double down on tests, right? This is again something I would say for any language where there's a lot of people writing code, but definitely true for Clojure, where people use the REPL a lot and they don't necessarily ensure that there's enough tests. If your code base is larger and you have a lot of PRs, I would also suggest that you have more checks added there, you know, linting, coverage, etc. And let other people build on the code that you've built before. So extract libraries from your services, and extracting schemas is something I've seen be very productive. And appoint maintainers for your libraries. That goes a long way in ensuring their lifespan. And for things that you can't extract libraries, like error handling and data validation, write down guidelines at the very least. Clojure has a bad rap for a slow startup time, but that doesn't really mean anything if you can do rolling deploys. Zero downtime deploys are essential, however, right? Like that's something that you have come to expect in a language like, you know, Golang or Rust or something like that, and it shouldn't be any less true for Clojure. And it's not that hard, right? Have your HA proxy or load balancer, just roll them off one by one and slowly increase traffic so that they can all warm up. Yeah, the deploy might be a little longer than other languages, but that's okay as long as you have zero downtime. Set this up with your first production deploy, pay off. Review your JVM memory settings and tune your GC if that's necessary. Don't allow latency spikes to happen. That's another usual suspect. Do not let people REPL into production. Have only a few people who have access to that power. It can be very disastrous if you don't do that. And one thing I've seen work time and again is tightening API schemas and data types. Given how dynamic the language is, this sort of ensures that it's not garbage in, garbage out. You know, you like keep the system sort of valuable in producing meaningful output if you have meaningful input. So tightening your API schemas and data types kind of makes up for a lack of strictness inside the code. So then in terms of creating success stories, you know, your happy feedback loop, showcase them, right? So your usual success story is like, you know, my two-person Clojure team ran way faster than this 10-person Java team, right? So speak about that. That really helps bring people over to your site. And it's not just developers, right? It's the business folks, because they see the time to market or time to production is much faster, and that's usually the selling point for Clojure. Fewer lines of code and expressive code also sells to developers, so you use that. Play to Clojure's strength, right? So you have data processing or parallel processing, immutable temporal databases or rule-based systems. These are home zone for Clojure. So if you're introducing or like you're looking to grow in the strengths, so then you can create more success stories and then you know, have that happy feedback loop. And like I said, use success stories to recruit into your team. In terms of recruiting more people into Clojure in your organization, try to run boot camps for interested groups, even outside the group of people who write Clojure. Right, so that might help them pick it up in whatever team they are in. Multiply yourself, right? Like you don't want everyone to depend on you, or like, you know, a set of 2-3 people. So create more of yourself, and by that what I mean is mentor more people to come into that sort of role. Encourage them to pick up boot camps. Encourage them to respond to other people in your beginner Clojure channel, which is a good idea if you don't have it yet. And recording yourself on video while you're refactoring or giving reviews, or even the bootcamp videos, that goes a long way in letting yourself last beyond your own time. And that's all I have. Thank you.